Today is May 23rd, 2026, and the most consequential economic confrontation of the current geopolitical moment is not unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz. It is not being decided inside the Security Council chamber, where 112 nations are co-sponsoring a resolution about Iranian behavior. It is not playing out in the underground bunkers where IRGC commanders are running calculations about their own survival. It is happening in the silence between two sentences spoken by two different men in two different capital cities, one of whom believed he had just executed the masterstroke of his presidency, and one of whom had been waiting with extraordinary patience and extraordinary preparation for exactly that moment to arrive. One of those men had a podium in the great hall of the people, the full diplomatic machinery of the world's most powerful nation at his disposal, and the cameras of every major outlet on earth pointed at his face. The other stood at a podium in Ottawa with two cameras, no teleprompter, and a folder he closed before the most important sentence he would ever speak, because he had memorized it months ago. Donald Trump, standing in Beijing on May 14th, looked into those cameras and said 4 words about Canada that no American president had ever said publicly about the country sharing the longest undefended border in the world. The country whose supply chains are woven so deeply into American manufacturing that 3.2 million American jobs depend on them directly. The country that provides 41% of total American crude oil imports with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon. He said, "Good runs, end." And then Mark Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa, stood still for a moment while the room went quiet, looked directly into the camera without notes, and delivered 9 words that were broadcast on every major network across 3 continents within hours. "You have misread us." And the misreading will be expensive. 2 leaders, 2 sentences, and the architecture of the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in human history, $800 billion annually across a century of alliance, sitting between them, waiting to learn which sentence reflected a plan and which one reflected a miscalculation. But here is what almost no one has asked yet. What if only one of those sentences was a surprise? Let's back all the way up. Because to understand why a press conference in Ottawa is reverberating through financial markets, diplomatic channels, and corporate boardrooms in ways that the official Beijing summit communique did not produce, you need to understand 3 things. What was agreed in Beijing 3 weeks before Trump arrived there publicly. Why the North American Manufacturing Priority Act was designed with one country specifically in mind. And what Mark Carney was doing with his phone, not after the Beijing agreements went public, but weeks before Air Force One ever touched down on Chinese soil. Here is where things stood as of May 23rd, 2026. 3 weeks before Trump's official Beijing visit, a quiet delegation left Washington without a press pool, without an official schedule, and without a diplomatic communique. They traveled commercial. They checked into separate hotels. They met in a building that does not appear in any official registry. 72 hours later, the architecture of what has now emerged as the most consequential backroom agreement in North American economic history had been drawn. Canada's industrial future was on the table. Canada was not in the room. On May 13th, the second day of Trump's official Beijing visit, the White House released a 47-page policy document called the North American Manufacturing Priority Act. The language was drafted by attorneys who understood precisely what they were constructing. The meaning required no legal training to read. Any company seeking maximum American federal tax incentives, and after the new schedule, those incentives were historic in scale, was required to locate all strategic production lines inside the United States. Not the continent, not North America, the United States, battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, defense supply chain inputs. And then came Section 14, Paragraph 3, a single provision written with one country in mind. Any company relocating strategic production capacity from a USMCA partner nation to the United States within 18 months would receive an additional 15% tax credit on top of existing federal incentives. They were not just pulling investment out of Canada. They were subsidizing the extraction. That same afternoon, Beijing moved the largest single-year bilateral agricultural purchase agreement in the history of Chinese-American trade relations. Soybeans, $42 billion. Beef, $18 billion. Pork, $11 billion. Wheat and feed grains, $23 billion. $94 billion in agricultural trade redirected overnight. Canada was not consulted. Canada was not notified. Canada was the mechanism through which two great powers had decided to serve their mutual interests simultaneously. Now let's get into why this specific combination of moves, the manufacturing incentive architecture and the agricultural contract redirection, represents something qualitatively different from ordinary trade policy and protectionism. This is not a tariff. Tariffs create price friction. This is a structural redesign of the investment and supply chain geography of an entire continent, executed through simultaneous tax incentive legislation and commodity contract redirection in a 72-hour window. While the affected party's prime minister was, according to Washington's assumption, reading briefings about what had just happened to his country's economic future, Trump wanted manufacturing jobs repatriated to American soil before the next electoral cycle. Xi Jinping wanted trade stability to arrest China's economic deceleration. The most efficient path to both goals ran directly through Ottawa, not past Ottawa, through it. A White House senior advisor speaking anonymously was quoted in the days that followed, "Why share industrial prosperity with Canada when America can keep all of it?" That sentence was leaked. It was published. And in Canada, it landed with the specific weight of a statement that is more devastating for being accurate about the intent than any diplomatic denial could address. It was not a slip. It was the framing. Read Section 14, Paragraph 3 in its full operational context, because this provision was not written by someone thinking about supply chain efficiency or North American manufacturing competitiveness in the abstract. This provision was written by someone thinking about Ontario's electric vehicle battery infrastructure. Specifically, Ontario had invested over $30 billion in EV manufacturing, battery plants, component lines, and research corridors linking university engineering departments to factory floors. The province had methodically, patiently, and with considerable success positioned itself to become what economists were beginning to call the EV capital of North America. The projection was on track until May 14, 2026. Within 48 hours of the Beijing agreements going public, 3 major Chinese battery manufacturers holding signed letters of intent with Ontario facilities announced simultaneous decisions. One relocated to Texas. One announced a new facility outside Phoenix. One issued a statement suspending all Canadian commitments indefinitely. Washington supplemented this with an announcement that Chinese companies choosing to manufacture inside the United States rather than Canada would receive streamlined regulatory approval, compressing processes that normally require years into 90 days. They were not just incentivizing the move. They were removing every friction point that had previously made it complicated. Now let's talk about what Canada actually sits on, because the strategic minerals dimension of this confrontation is the element that transforms it from a bilateral trade dispute into a structural geopolitical realignment whose consequences extend to every major economy on Earth. Canada possesses some of the largest deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth elements on the planet. These are not optional industrial inputs. They are the physical material that every battery, every semiconductor, every defense system, every renewable energy installation on Earth requires to function. There is no electric vehicle without lithium. There is no advanced semiconductor without cobalt. There is no modern military weapon system without the rare earth elements whose global supply chain is currently dominated by China, and whose alternative supply base is dominated by Canada and Australia. For decades, this resource endowment was Canada's quiet strategic insurance. No major power could simply sideline a nation sitting on that scale of critical material wealth. The Beijing agreements were designed to neutralize that insurance. Washington committed to dramatically accelerating domestic critical mineral extraction. Fast-tracking permits stalled for years, overriding review timelines, directing the Defense Production Act toward American mining at a scale not seen since the Second World War. Beijing simultaneously agreed to redirect Chinese investment capital away from Canadian mining projects and toward American mineral development equivalents. Canadian mining stocks fell an average of 14% in the single week following Trump's return from Beijing. Two major lithium projects in British Columbia, both carrying secured Chinese financing, saw that financing suspended within 10 days of the agreements going public. A confidential internal assessment circulated to Canadian cabinet members, later obtained by investigative journalists, contained one sentence that captured the entire strategic shift. Canada is at risk of becoming a raw material supplier, while all value-added production migrates south of the border. Not a partner in the supply chain, a quarry. Now let's talk about Mark Carney, because understanding who this man is and what he has actually done in the highest-stakes financial environments of the modern world is understanding why Trump's characterization of him as weak and all talk is the specific kind of misreading his press conference warned would be expensive, and why that misreading may have been something Carney quietly relied upon. Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada. He guided the country through the 2008 financial crisis with more precision and less institutional damage than any comparable advanced economy achieved in the same period. He was then appointed governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen in the institution's 300-year history to hold that role. He served 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs, navigating the most complex financial negotiations the private sector generates. His doctorate in economics is from Oxford. This is not a politician who learned economics as a policy tool. This is an economist who spent 3 decades at the absolute apex of the global financial system, managing crises worth trillions of dollars, negotiating with governments and institutions that held the leverage in those conversations, and learning in those rooms that the most dangerous people are never the ones who announce what they are going to do. They are the ones who have already done it before anyone else has noticed. He does not raise his voice in public. He does not reach for outrage. He moves with the stillness of someone who knows that in the rooms where real decisions happen, a single misplaced word costs billions, and that the negotiators who have internalized that constraint are the ones whose silence is more threatening than anyone else's loudest statement. Here is what Washington assumed, that the night the Beijing agreements became fully public, Carney would scramble, that he would call Washington in a panic, that he would post a statement on social media, that he would convene an emergency press conference with the desperate energy of a leader caught off guard. Here is what Carney actually did. He sat at his desk and read every page of the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, Section 14, Paragraph 3, every line of the Agricultural Contract Framework, the Critical Minerals Investment Redirection Provisions, 4 hours of reading, then 3 phone calls, not to Washington, not to London, to Tokyo, to Berlin, and to a third capital that has not been publicly identified. But here's the question that reframes everything. When did those calls actually begin? Because sovereign investment funds capitalized at $40 billion do not appear fully structured 48 hours after the triggering event, unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, and the investment mandate were already prepared before the triggering event occurred. Because the EU industrial corridor that Brussels announced with complete documentation, investment timelines, and legal framework within days of the Beijing agreements had been in drafting for 3 months. Because the preferential mineral supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, signed within days, carry the signature of negotiations that do not happen in 72 hours. The picture that emerges, once you arrange the timeline with precision, is not the picture of a country scrambling to respond. It is the picture of a country that had been building its response architecture for the better part of a year, and was waiting for the moment it would need to deploy it. Carney, it appears, had been watching Washington's trajectory toward this move long before Beijing, and had been preparing accordingly. 48 hours after Air Force One touched down at Joint Base Andrews, Mark Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa, maple leaf flags behind him, 2 cameras, no teleprompter. He stood still for a moment. The room went quiet. Canada is not a bargaining chip. He let that settle across 3 seconds of silence that every camera in the room held without cutting. Canada is not a concession in someone else's framework. Canada is not a line item negotiated in rooms where it was not invited to sit. Canada is not a country whose industrial future gets decided by bilateral arrangements designed in its absence. 3 days ago, the President of the United States sat in Beijing and agreed, with a government that Canada has been diplomatically managing with careful consistency since the Cold War, to a set of arrangements designed explicitly to reduce Canada's manufacturing capacity, redirect Canada's export markets, and undermine Canada's investment environment. He did not consult us. He did not notify us. He did not extend the basic diplomatic courtesy that one nation extends to another after more than a century of alliance. And this morning he posted on social media that Canada should fix our economy. He looked up from his notes. He looked directly into the camera. I want to respond to that clearly. Canada's economy does not need fixing by those who would dismantle it. It needs to be defended from those who treat partnership as a resource to be extracted and an alliance as a convenience to be discarded the moment a more profitable arrangement appears across the Pacific. He closed the folder. He did not look away from the camera. To those who believe that Canada will absorb this quietly, that patience is the same as weakness, that restraint is the same as submission, 3 seconds of complete silence. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. That press conference was viewed 47 million times in the first 24 hours. It was not viewed that many times because it was dramatic. Political speeches go viral for drama. This was not dramatic. It was cold, precise, controlled. The stillness of a man who is telling you exactly what he has prepared, and who has prepared everything. 47 million views because the people watching it, including the people in Washington who did not want to be watching it, understood that they were not watching someone performing. They were watching someone reporting. This is what I know. This is what I have planned. This is what is going to happen. Trump's response came the following morning on Truth Social. Carney is all talk, no action. Canada's economy is a mess, and he's giving speeches. Very weak. 6 words. Very weak. From the man who had just restructured the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in human history in 72 hours without consulting the country being restructured. The characterization of weakness arrived before the 6 countermoves had fully become visible. By the time they did become visible, the characterization required revision. Now let's get into the 6 simultaneous moves, because what Carney executed in the 72 hours following the Beijing agreements going public is the strategic response that will be studied in diplomatic programs for a generation. None of them were announced as a package. None were presented as retaliation. Each one was framed with deliberate precision as a routine exercise of Canadian sovereign economic policy. Together, they constituted the most coordinated economic counterpositioning by a middle-sized power against a superpower in modern diplomatic history. Move 1. Canada formally notified the United States Trade Representative that it was initiating a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, specifically flagging Section 14 relocation incentives as potential violations of the agreement's investment neutrality provisions. Not a threat. A legal process. Quiet, procedurally correct, and impossible to dismiss because it invokes a binding international agreement that the United States itself negotiated, signed, and has repeatedly cited as the framework governing North American trade relationships. The compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. It will run. It will generate findings. Those findings will carry legal weight that press conference denials cannot override. Move 2. Canada announced an emergency expansion of its Critical Minerals Investment Authority, a new sovereign fund capitalized at $40 billion, specifically structured to replace the Chinese investment capital that had been redirected away from Canadian mining projects. This was not reactive improvisation. Sovereign funds of this capitalization do not appear fully structured 48 hours after the triggering event unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, and the investment mandate were already prepared before the triggering event occurred. Carney had been building this since well before his Tokyo phone call. Move 3. Canada announced a new bilateral industrial partnership with the European Union, a fast-tracked manufacturing investment corridor that EU trade officials had been drafting for 3 months, waiting for exactly this political moment. The Brussels announcement arrived with complete documentation, investment timelines, and legal framework precisely because it had been prepared in anticipation of a moment when Canadian assets would become available at a discount, and the European Union would have the commercial and strategic justification to acquire positions in those assets at scale. Move 4. Canada announced preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia for critical mineral supply, positioning Canada as the primary alternative to Chinese mineral supply for allied nations, increasingly focused on supply chain resilience and the geopolitical risks of Chinese supply chain dominance. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are three of the four countries whose industrial economies most urgently need a trusted alternative supplier of the critical minerals that China currently dominates globally and that Canada possesses in abundance. Canada had just become the explicit preferred alternative supplier for all three simultaneously. Move 5. Carney's office released a full economic impact assessment of what American supply chains actually depend on from Canada. Not a political document, an economic document prepared by Statistics Canada and three independent research institutions. The numbers were specific, and they were designed to be specific. Bilateral trade over $800 billion annually. American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains, 3.2 million. American energy imports from Canada with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon, 41% of total American crude. These numbers were not produced for the press conference. They were produced for the boardrooms of the 3.2 million American workers, employers, and for the energy market analysts who track the 41% crude import dependency. The document was arithmetic, presented to the audience that reads arithmetic most carefully, not voters, shareholders, CEOs, bond market participants, central bank governors, and allied capitals. Move 6 was the most operationally consequential of all six, and the one that produced the most immediate measurable results. Carney personally called the CEOs of 11 major American corporations with significant operations in both countries, not to threaten them, to inform them. He told each of them, calmly and with complete specificity, exactly what Section 14 relocation incentives would cost them in Canadian regulatory cooperation, Canadian resource access, and Canadian market participation if they chose to pursue them. He was not issuing ultimatums. He was doing the math with them out loud in real time, allowing each CEO to perform for themselves the calculation that their own financial advisors would eventually present to them anyway. When the calls were done, 7 of the 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing any relocation review pending further regulatory clarity. 3 companies did not move immediately but have since initiated their own internal reviews. 1 company proceeded and has subsequently discovered that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval that Washington advertised has in practice involved timelines closer to 4 years. Now let's talk about what has happened in the 3 weeks since the Beijing summit, because the immediate market and corporate reactions have begun to be followed by secondary and tertiary effects that tell you which side of this confrontation had correctly modeled the response dynamics. The 3 Chinese battery manufacturers that pivoted away from Ontario within 48 hours of the Beijing agreements. 2 of them have quietly reinitiated contact with their original Canadian partners. The reason is not diplomatic pressure. The reason is not political sentiment. The reason is that American regulatory timelines, the 90-day streamlined approval that Washington advertised, turned out in practice to require the 4-year process that the regulatory framework actually mandates, regardless of political preference. The Chinese manufacturers did the math. Canada was still faster. The infrastructure was already there. The workforce was already trained. The supply chain connections were already built. The $30 billion Ontario had invested had produced a platform that could not be replicated in a new American location without the time and investment costs that erased the incentive the 15% additional credit was supposed to provide. The tax credit was large enough to generate announcements. It was not large enough to make the full economics of relocation work for manufacturers who had already built their Canadian operations to operational readiness. The agricultural contracts between Beijing and Washington, the $94 billion redirected overnight, tell their own secondary story. Canadian canola exports to China fell sharply in the immediate period following the contracts. Canadian grain farmers in Saskatchewan experienced the specific kind of acute economic pain that the futures price collapse on the day of the announcement had telegraphed. A grain farmer outside Regina, who had sold canola to China for 22 years, sat in his truck in his own field for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to call his bank. He did not say he was angry. He said, "We are being replaced." Two words that captured everything about the human dimension of a geopolitical transaction, executed in rooms where neither he nor anyone representing his interests was present. But within 30 days, Canada had accelerated negotiations with India and Indonesia to absorb the displaced volume at comparable price points. The market diversification that the displacement forced Canada to execute has produced a more resilient agricultural export architecture than the single dominant buyer model that preceded the Beijing agreements. The pain was real. The structural result may be more durable than the arrangement it replaced. The critical minerals investment gap has produced results that were not visible in the immediate aftermath, but are now defining the medium-term picture. 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed a combined $22 billion to Canadian mining projects in the weeks following the Beijing agreements, capital that had been standing by, watching the Canadian mining sector with interest, waiting for the moment when assets became available at a discount. Trump had created a sale. The buyers who arrived at that sale were not American. They were European. And the strategic consequence of European sovereign capital owning significant positions in Canadian critical mineral production is a different geopolitical outcome from the one the Beijing agreements were designed to produce. The agreements were designed to leave Canada without the investment capital to develop its critical mineral assets, allowing Washington to position American domestic extraction as the alternative supply base for Allied critical mineral demand. Instead, Allied capital has flowed to Canadian assets, making Canada the critical mineral supplier of record for European, Japanese, Korean, and Australian industrial demand, while simultaneously giving those allied economies a direct financial stake in Canadian resource development that creates its own structural support for Canadian supply chain integration with the broader allied economic architecture. A Wall Street analyst published a note that circulated to every major financial desk on 3 continents. It read, "The administration appears to have confused Canada's patience with Canada's weakness. The distinction is becoming expensive. That assessment is not partisan commentary. It is the financial sector's reading of the transaction data, the corporate announcement patterns, the investment flow records, and the compliance review timeline that together constitute the measurable outcomes of the confrontation so far." Now let's talk about the 4-second pause. 1 week after Air Force One returned from Beijing, a journalist at a White House press briefing asked the press secretary whether the administration had calculated what a successful Canadian USMCA compliance claim would cost American businesses in the affected sectors. The press secretary said, "We are not concerned about that." The journalist followed up by asking whether the administration had reviewed the Canadian Economic Impact Assessment, the document showing 3.2 million American jobs tied to Canadian supply chains. The press secretary said, "We will take a look at that." And then the journalist asked the question the entire room had been building toward. When the president said Canada's good run is over, is that the official position of this administration on the alliance? The press secretary paused. The cameras caught it. 4 seconds of pause before a spokesperson whose entire professional function is to answer questions without hesitation chose silence. And then she said, "Next question." That 4-second pause was broadcast on every major Canadian network that evening, played directly next to Carney's press conference. The contrast did not require commentary. One man had looked into a camera with no notes, no teleprompter, and said exactly what he believed, clearly, precisely, without hesitation, with the stillness of someone who had prepared every word and knew the words were accurate. The other side had needed 4 seconds to decide what it was permitted to say, and then chose to say nothing at all. Now let's bring the complete picture together into the frame that makes this confrontation the most consequential economic power demonstration of the post-Beijing summit period. The North American Manufacturing Priority Act is law. Section 14, Paragraph 3 is in effect. The agricultural contracts are signed, the investment has begun moving, and simultaneously, 7 of the 11 American CEOs Carney called are pausing relocation reviews. 2 of the 3 Chinese battery manufacturers are back in conversation with their Canadian partners. 3 European sovereign wealth funds have committed $22 billion to Canadian mining. Canada has signed preferential mineral supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The EU fast-tracked industrial corridor is being built. The USMCA compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. The economic impact assessment, with 3.2 million American jobs, sits on record at every financial analysis desk covering North American trade. And the 4-second pause at the White House podium is playing on a loop in Ottawa. Trump arrived in Beijing bold, loud, and certain. He left believing he had won everything. He restructured the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in human history in 72 hours. He did not consult the country being restructured. He told the world Canada's good run was over. He posted on Truth Social that Carney was weak, and he was certain. That certainty is the miscalculation, because the man who walked to a podium in Ottawa with no teleprompter and closed his folder before the most important sentence was not performing certainty. He was reporting on preparation that had been underway for months. The sovereign fund was already drafted. The EU corridor was already in negotiation. The Tokyo and Berlin relationships were already warm. The CEO call list was already written. The compliance review was already authored. The economic impact numbers were already verified. While Trump was calibrating his Great Hall of the People statement, Carney had already placed the calls. While Air Force One was in the air returning from Beijing, Carney was on the phone with 11 American CEOs doing math with them out loud. While Trump was posting on Truth Social about weakness, Carney's sovereign fund was being capitalized, his EU corridor was being finalized, his preferential mineral agreements were being signed, and his compliance review was being filed. Trump was bold in Beijing. Carney was ready in Ottawa, and had been ready long before Beijing ever happened. The manufacturing incentives are law. The agricultural contracts are signed. The USMCA compliance review is running without a scheduled end date. The 3.2 million jobs are on a spreadsheet that nobody at the White House podium wanted to address. The 4-second pause is on the record. And the question that 12 months of outcomes will answer, the question that every boardroom, every financial desk, every allied government, and every sovereignty-conscious middle power is now watching, is not whether Canada was caught off guard. The question is whether it ever was. The man who announced the end of Canada's good run may have walked into a response that had been waiting for him, structured, capitalized, legally filed, and diplomatically wired, months before he ever landed in Beijing. The misreading, as Carney said without raising his voice, will be expensive. The only thing still being determined is how expensive, and for whom, and whether the trap was the press conference or everything that came before it.